Michael Heiser will address his topic, No Room at the Inn, Can the Judeo-Christian Worldview Accommodate an Intelligent ET Reality? That should be wonderful. Mike has had a lifelong interest in the paranormal, particularly ufology and the subject of extraterrestrial life, although on his website, you might make a note of this, he claims he has never been abducted. And he says the unidentified metal object in his calf is not an implant. Mike lectures frequently on the topics of divine beings and angels, specializing in critical evaluation of the belief that UFOs and aliens are found in ancient Near Eastern texts. Mike does translation work in a dozen ancient languages, including Aramaic, Phoenician, Moabite, Akkadian, Hebrew, Sumerian, Ugaritic, cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and yes, there's more. In his spare time, he is planning to work on Coptic, Ethiopic, Sanskrit, and Mayan. I'm glad he stopped there. Mike's views on the relationship between extraterrestrials and divine beings are laid out graphically in his fictional novelization of the subject entitled The Facade. Further analysis may be found in his ebook available through his website, Islam and Armageddon. Mike is currently preparing a response to Zecharia Sitchin's Ancient Astronaut Theory. It's my pleasure now to welcome Mike Heiser to address the topic, No Room at the Inn? Can the Judeo-Christian worldview accommodate an intelligent extraterrestrial reality? Please welcome Mike Heiser. He says he's also not an alien.
Yeah, they had to throw that implant thing in there. I'm kind of in the position to, being at the end, to sort of say something evaluative, and I would like to do that, but I'd like to distinguish between what I'm not going to talk about for the hour and what I am going to talk about. Now, at the position that we are at in the program, I mean, we've heard Richard, and Richard has laid out his case for artificiality. Of course, he's very committed to the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And we've heard Dave, as I see it, Dave trying to get across the message that the ancients, for whatever reason, thought in certain ways. And there are motifs, there's vocabulary, there's motifs, there's architecture, there are full writings in the ancient world that have shared commonalities, including the Old Testament. And it appears in some way that there is some sort of correspondence between Mars in mythology that runs through these mythologies and the Old Testament, and of course then as we moderns pick it up, using that and asking some of these extraterrestrial questions and as it relates to Mars. Now, it makes you want to ask, okay, who's right? If Richard is right, if these are artificial structures as it relates to the bigger picture here in my own topic, if he's right, we'll bring in Paul here as well, that infers intelligence, if these are artificial structures. Now, that doesn't mean it's extraterrestrial. It means that there's intelligence. It also means that Dave's paradigm becomes more important because that introduces the whole idea, okay, why were the ancients able to deduce certain things and put certain things into their belief system that we sort of stumble over now? I mean, it has to mean something. There's so much of this, both in terms of frequency and quantity. There's so much of this patterning that it has to mean something. Now, if Richard's wrong, and these are not artificial, they're natural, Dave still has to come up with an explanation for why the patterning is there. Now, Richard, of course, says it's ET. Dave would say, and I checked with Dave just to make sure that I'm reading him correctly, Dave would say it's E.T., okay, in quotation marks, meaning that this is a higher intelligence, but it's not alien like we would think of. Dave would prefer a supernatural explanation. God and the gods or angels, however we want to parse that, this is the explanation that knowledge was handed down, much as it says in the Old Testament and in the book of Enoch, that there's a certain body of knowledge handed down, not from beings from another planet. By the way, I define extraterrestrial as a being that has a determinate lifespan, has to eat, has to intake water, has to, have air. I mean, again, this is all carbon-based, but has to do the things we do, reproduces, goes to work, hates his job, has kids. But I mean, they have definite lifespans. They live and die. Okay, that is not the way that angels are described in the literature. Okay, so there is a dichotomy there. So on the one hand, one side says it's extraterrestrial with that meaning. I mean, these are naturalistic or natural life forms, biological life forms. And what Dave is saying is, well, we don't need that to have an answer, because the ancients, all the way from BC through the Common Era, the rabbis, all the way back to the Canaanites going the other direction, the Egyptians, they all share these motifs because they share a common belief, a common memory of the distant past, the primeval past. And what happened in Dave's view is that a supernatural being, God as it were, or his angels, fallen or unfallen, created the universe this way, that the mathematical designs of it are built in and show us intelligence, and that something went wrong, and now we have a competition on earth, as in heaven, so on earth. The spiritual forces in the heavens battling it out with the forces on earth, the people of God being confronted by evil in whatever form, but there is a cosmic battle and there's an earthly battle that somehow in the mythology and in the religion uses these common motifs, and Cydonia has something to do with that. Now, Dave he didn't mention this in his presentation, but he is drawing from an old tradition. He mentioned one phrase in Ezekiel, the stones of fire. He's taking that to be planets. That is possible. That is exegetically possible. That is a motif. Those are phrases that do get those meanings in ancient texts. Doesn't mean that they always get those meanings, but they do get them. And so Dave is drawing on a tradition that's very old, all the way up through the rabbinical period, the period of the early church, that believed that the planets were inhabited not by extraterrestrials, again, living, dying, having kids, hating their jobs, but they were inhabited by spiritual beings that could or could not take physical form and interact with Earth. Okay, Dave's not inventing that. He's not necessarily even recovering it, although I'd be willing to say that of his work. It does need to be recovered in a lot of ways, but the rabbis and the early church fathers, this is where they were at. They were part of their worldview, which is part of the Pythagorean system. So those are the two views. Now we get to Dr. Ross, who says there's basically no chance that there's an extraterrestrial life form. Again, on the one hand, that would be, I think it would be trouble with a small t for Richard, because Richard would just go and look somewhere else for other evidence. Again, operating from that paradigm. I don't think it's trouble for Dave. I think it's small t trouble for Dave, because Dave could say, hey, yeah, I don't believe there are physical aliens out there. I don't need it. I don't need them anywhere in the universe. What I do need are spiritual life forms, which Dr. Ross, of course, would assent to, the spiritual world, the world that God and other divine beings, angels, inhabit. And then with Dr. Nelson made an interesting statement, and I want to plant this seed for the panel discussion, because, hey, I get to do that. And that is, when he talked about Cydonia, he had on the nice PowerPoint presentation. Again, I'm a techno idiot, so I wouldn't even dare bring PowerPoint into the picture. But he had intelligent versus supernatural, these vocabulary words. Which one, should we incorporate, should we have into science, and which one would apply to Cydonia? And he said, well, if there is something there, he would use the word intelligent. What I'd like to know is, would you not use the word supernatural? Okay, because that is where Dave is at, the supernatural explanation for something being on Cydonia, if indeed there is something there. So with that seed planted, we come down to me. Now, all of that is set up for the panel. It's set up for question and answer. And so we're just going to move that to the side, and we're just going to presume for the sake of this discussion, hey, what if it's all real? Okay, what if there are extraterrestrials out there? Whether we've been visited or not, let's just say that, hey, somebody finds something that meets the criteria for evidence that Dr. Nelson went over, goes through the filters correctly, there are no mistakes made, there's no logical errors, it's real data. Can the Judeo-Christian worldview sustain that? Can it accommodate that? That's what I want to focus on. Let me go back to the negative side, though. Again, what I'm not going to say or cover are things like, UFOs and abductions. We're going to push that to the side. We're talking about hard sciences here, again, without the question drifting off into whether the UFO thing delves with that or overlaps with it in any way. We're just going to think, academically for the time being. And that's not to imply that people who are interested in UFOs are non-academic, but you follow what I mean. We're not going to really focus on either the what I will call, for lack of a better term, mainline denominations or liberal denominations as they refer to Judaism or Christianity. Most of what you will read on this subject, the interface of Judeo-Christian religion with the question of extraterrestrial life, most of what you'll read in real academic journals that are written by religious types, either priests or religious scholars, theologians, most of that comes from a theological perspective where they don't need, from their perspective, they don't need to take the Bible at face value. They don't have a view of inspiration that would sort of say, well, every word is inspired and it's authoritative, it's infallible. They're not terribly careful or don't really have to be too meticulous on things like how do we define who Jesus was, God, man, something else in between, or how do we define our terms? I mean, there's lots of fudge room. The people I want to target with are the ones that you ought to, I think, really think of when this subject comes up. And if you listen to when Richard and I were on the show, Coast to Coast AM, a few weeks ago, Art Bell kept going, and he was very honest. He said, "Look, I'm going to play the fundamentalist. I'm going to play the fundamentalist believer, and just go after you guys." And that's the audience that I want to target, because the subject is largely unaddressed, and it's a very fearful one when it comes to those groups. And there are reasons for why the idea of an extraterrestrial reality scares those groups theologically. So that's what I want to hit on. It's in one sense, it's a purely hypothetical. Again, I'm not staking a claim as to whether I think they're ETs or not. I mean, right now I guess I'd have to be agnostic, but I'm open. I mean, it's not going to bother me, and that will be evident as I go through this. On one sense, it would be really neat. In the other sense, I really don't care. I mean, so there's something in between there. I don't care in the sense that it's not going to make me give up anything in my faith. And on the other hand, it would be really neat just because it would be so different. It'd be so dramatic. It would be so climactic. So just so you know a little bit about where I am, where I'm going, my goal today, again, is to target really, really conservative Christians and really, really conservative Jews. Muslims don't have so much of a problem with the question because the Quran has certain passages in it that talk about other worlds, and so they don't really get thrown into the mix too much. So we're going to concentrate on the other two areas. And so I have a twofold target, twofold goal. One is to demonstrate to those people in that group. So pretend that you're in that group. We're going to be talking theology here. For some of you, it'll be very familiar. For some of you, it won't be familiar at all. But we'll try to make it translatable even to those in the latter group. But I want to demonstrate that compatibility is possible, even if you take a very strict view of the Bible. What I'm going to suggest is that if there were an extraterrestrial reality, you don't have to give up your view of the inspiration of the Bible. You don't have to feel like you're fudging on any point of doctrine. You don't have to resort to a system of interpretation that just allegorizes everything to death and the text doesn't mean what it says. You don't have to give up any of that. And I think that people in those groups, that's where they're at. There's just a panic that it's either my faith or it's this. And what I'm saying is, no, that is not the question. That's not the dichotomy. So my second goal is to demonstrate that the question in and of itself is important because people need to intelligently defend their faith. I ran across an article by Ernan McMullen, who's an internationally respected philosopher of science, who used to teach at Notre Dame, and he said, a religion which is unable to find a place for ET, or extraterrestrial persons, in its view of God and the universe, might find it difficult to command terrestrial assent in the days to come. That is, if this ever happens, if this ever is shown to be real. And the church, again, the conservative church, has put all its eggs in one basket, and the basket gets run over by a cosmic truck, okay, it's going to be in trouble if it hasn't thought through the issue. And the answer is not to dump your faith or just dilute it into nothing, where it's just meaningless. It's just, it's pablum. Okay, that is not what I'm going to propose to you today. So, getting started here, a little historical perspective. It didn't used to be this way. It might shock you that in bygone centuries, some of the leading enthusiasts for extraterrestrial life out there somewhere in the universe were Christians and were Christian theologians. Again, that is not the case today for a variety of factors. Just a quick survey. This goes all the way back to Aristotle, and I'm going to reference Michael Crow, who was a professor in the history and philosophy of science at Notre Dame as well. He has a book called The Extraterrestrial Life Debate, which is, again, a historical philosophical survey of this. So I'm borrowing, some of his observations and his work there. It goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, who were opposed to the idea of extraterrestrials. And since many Christian theologians followed their work, followed their systems, and merging philosophy and theology, many of the early Christian theologians were opposed. But around 1277, a remarkable development occurred. In that year, Etienne Tempier, the Bishop of Paris, issued a condemnation of doctrines that seemed to set limits to God's omnipotence. So this guy the bishop comes up with a list. Hey, these are the doctrines, these are teachings we don't like, that the church is forbidding because they limit God's omnipotence, his all-powerful ability. One of the propositions condemned was, quote, that the first cause, God, cannot make many worlds. So the church officially came out condemning the idea that there weren't other worlds. This was the official proclamation. This is 1277. This is back when they still believe the Bible's inspired. Okay, this isn't the late 19th century, the early 20th century, where we get critical methodology, higher criticism, liberal theology. I mean, they took it, they believed everything, hook, line, sinker, every jot and tittle. They weren't about to fudge on what the text said, and they didn't have any problem with it. In fact, they said, if you don't believe this, you are limiting God, and that's not a good thing to do. Now, this openness led to the introduction of what Christian philosophers would call the principle of plenitude during the Renaissance. This was a philosophical, theological idea. It's not a biblical one in that you're not going to find a verse that talks about the multiplication of other worlds, and we'll get to the biblical absence of that. But it was a theological or philosophical one. Hey, God can do lots of things. He's omnipotent. He could do this. The principle of plenitude posited that an omnipotent creator, like that proposed in the Bible, must of necessity bring to all that is possible to fully honor his own goodness and power. And since it's possible that he could have made other worlds, if he didn't, that position would have God not doing all he could to glorify himself. So it stands to reason that, hey, there's lots of worlds out there. This was the official position of the church. During the Reformation, though, the principle of plenitude faced some opposition, particularly from the Lutheran reformer Philip Melanchthon. If you're Lutheran, you would know that name, who in 1550 warned that Copernican cosmology would lead to the idea that Christ's incarnation and redemption could have occurred on another planet. A few decades later, René Descartes disputed Melanchthon's contention that the idea of ETs was a threat to these doctrines when he said, this is Descartes, I do not see at all that the mystery of the incarnation and all the other advantages that God has brought forth for man obstruct him from having brought forth an infinity of other great very advantages for an infinity of other creatures. And although I do not at all infer from this that there would be intelligent creatures in the stars or elsewhere, I also do not see that there would be any reason by which to prove that there were not. Okay, this is Descartes. He's a loyal Catholic. So even during the Reformation period, when some Christians are saying, boy, if we say this, Then, this idea of Jesus having to be crucified again for the ET on some other planet. Now that, I'm just going to tip my hand to where I'm going. That is one of what I see as 4 or 5 pseudo problems in theology. I think that is a flawed question. I think it's packed with flawed assumptions. But when you read the literature, when religion interfaces with the extraterrestrial question, this always comes up. Well, Christ died for the sins of the world, and if ET is intelligent, if ET could have some kind of religious feeling or religious affinity, or ET would want to commune with God, is he automatically cut off and he gets sent to hell? I mean, it just doesn't sound right. And so this whole question of Christ having to kind of do it over again for any race out there in the cosmos became an issue for theologians in this area. Belief in extraterrestrials among Christians and Christian theologians continued to be quite prominent during the Enlightenment. Near the end of the 18th century, the consensus within the church, was that the universe was teeming with life. Many Christians believed the possibility actually enhanced one's religious perspective in light of the principle of plenitude. It showed God was really omnipotent, even more than we thought. The acceptance of extraterrestrial life among Christians was soon undermined, however, by one of the Enlightenment's major thinkers. In 1793, Thomas Paine argued in his book, The Age of Reason, that astronomical science had made it impossible for any thinking person to accept the central Christian notions of a divine incarnation and a redeemer. In confronting Christianity with the ET claim, Paine became a deist, that is, a person accepting a remote, impersonal God, but denying such central Christian doctrines as Christ's incarnation, that Christ was God in the flesh, and redemption, that when Christ died on the cross, it was the atoning sacrifice for the sins of the whole world. Okay, the deists didn't believe that. They believed in a God, but they didn't believe that. Now, in Paine's own words, and we're all familiar with Thomas Paine, from whence could arise the strange conceit that the Almighty should come to die in our world because, they say, one man and one woman had eaten an apple. And on the other hand, are we to suppose that every world in the boundless creation had an Eve, an apple, a serpent, and a redeemer? In this case, the person who is irreverently called the Son of God, and sometimes God himself, would have nothing else to do than to travel from world to world in an endless succession of death with scarcely a momentary interval of life. He'd be dying all the time. And so Paine is saying, this idea that there's all these worlds out there, you just cannot hold to Christian theology and believe this. He was the first one to really go after what was then the consensus view. Again, now, look at what he's assuming. He's assuming there has to be a fall. He's assuming that a fall, if there was such a thing, it would be the same as on earth. He's assuming that there has to be redemption. He's assuming that there has to be incarnation. When we get to this point in a few minutes, I'm going to show that all these assumptions are flawed. Okay? But this was really a gauntlet that was laid down. In essence, what Paine was saying, look, you either have to reject the belief in extraterrestrial life or you have to reject your Christianity, period. And his opinion held sway for a long time. Now, there were people who reacted to him. Timothy Dwight, who was the president of Yale University, a very famous evangelical preacher. Thomas Chalmers overseas, the same way, very evangelical, a very famous preacher. They objected to Paine's views, and they would debate with him in print and in sermons and things like that. But the tide was sort of turned, that this became a serious thing theologically, that you would have to dump your faith. Support for the idea of extraterrestrial life continued through the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the church, but it soon became a threat that many Christians see it to be today. With the advent of Darwinism, Christians and Jews who took the Bible's claim of a divine creator seriously began to view scientists as antagonistic to the faith, and many were. There were a lot of scientists who were very dedicated, devout Christians who accepted Darwinism. There are a lot of those today. In my own church, in Madison, Wisconsin, we have the head of the botany department, we have the head of environmental studies, we have 2 research physicists, we have at least 1 PhD student in geology, we've had 2 or 3 entomologists, PhDs go through our ranks. We've got just a pile of grad students. For some reason, they're heavily stilted toward the sciences. I mean, this is common. if you think that Christianity is monolithic in its perspective on origins, extraterrestrial life, all sorts of things, you need to get your head out of the sand, and you need to stop caricaturing the other side. Okay, Payne was very antagonistic, and we shouldn't be that. I mean, we need to investigate the other side. And so this whole thing about injecting Darwinism into it shouldn't necessarily deter a Christian from entertaining the question of extraterrestrial life. That's going to be another problem I'll hit in a few minutes, that somehow it's gotten in our minds that if ET is out there, it proves evolution. Why? Why? But that is out there. Okay, so that Darwin came in, and so a combination of Payne and Darwin just started to essentially pummel the church in this area and drive people out. Now, a few observations. Historically speaking, number one, the church has in many instances been quite supportive of the idea of extraterrestrial life. So to say otherwise, that this has always been the bane of the church, is just wrong. Two, the idea of extraterrestrial life did raise important theological questions within the church, like the incarnation and redemption, but these questions were not viewed by many theologians as having any significant impact at all. There were some that felt threatened and lots that didn't. In this regard, it's significant, again, that we're dealing with theologians in an era, again, in the era when it was most supported, that is previous to methods used by liberal Jews and liberal Christians today to interpret the Bible. These guys like Timothy Dwight, Chalmers, way back into the church fathers, these were people who believed that the Bible was inspired, that it came from God. It was revelation from God, it was authoritative, and it was infallible, and they had no problem with this. Okay, that we need to keep in mind. Now, two things drove the church away and continues to drive the church away, and I've alluded to both, so I'll summarize them here. One is the manufacture of pseudo-theological problems from Christianity's enemies, people like Payne, who were deists. In other words, why does Payne get to create the theological problem and then impose the problem on the church and define the terms for the church and then say, you church, you can't cope with this? Why is that? Well, we'll get to that, but he did. The second thing is the logically unnecessary linkage of naturalistic random evolution to the idea of extraterrestrial life. Now, the former, the theological problems, made Christians wonder if extraterrestrial life was a problem. The latter forced Christians to distance themselves from the idea by default because they didn't want to be evolutionists. So these are the things that, in an umbrella sense, that are plaguing the issue, that are affecting the issue. Had Enlightenment deists like Payne not used the issue to attack Christianity, things might be different today. Had evolutionists, people who would be non-theistic in their naturalism, not linked the idea of extraterrestrial life to their system of science, to their methodology, things might be different today. Had ministers and theologians not ignored the issue, and had they been astute enough to confront bad theology when they saw it and teach their people, things might be different today. But here we are today. Here are what I see as 4 fear generators within, or to people who are very conservative theological in Judaism and Christianity. Here are the 4 humps that they'd have to get over. Number 1, they're afraid that the notion of intelligent alien life undoes the doctrine of the inerrancy of the Bible. Okay, some people are in this camp that, hey, if the Bible doesn't say it, it's not true. I can't find any verses in the Bible that talk about extraterrestrials or other planets, therefore, it's not true. I'm not going to try to be too kind here. That is really naive. I mean, what else isn't in the Bible? I mean, look around the room. Radio, microphones, toilet paper. What has to be in the Bible? Microwaves. Where do we come up with this? How about the other planets? I mean, for crying out loud, where's Saturn? It is just unworkable. It's a silly argument that if you are in this camp, again, conservative Jew or Christian, you don't live this way anyway. I mean, you interact and use things all the time that are not in the Bible. So what is the big deal? Nevertheless, people are there, and what I'm suggesting is get over it. Okay, broaden your worldview, look around you, either that or eliminate everything in your life that is not in the Bible. And that's probably where we get hermits, and pole sitters and things like that. I mean, it's not going to work. Number 2, second problem, second fear generator is the notion of intelligent alien life, quote unquote, proves or at least supports the theories of naturalistic evolution and panspermia. Panspermia, Dr. Ross, again, touching on this today, that life was seeded from space either in an undirected way, an accidental way, a random way, or directed panspermia, that ET, planted life on Earth, okay, deliberately. There's intent and there's intelligence there. Now, to some extent, this objection is as irrelevant as the first, since there were many theologically conservative Jews and Christians, especially those with advanced graduate degrees in science, who embraced the theory of evolution. Okay, there's lots of those. I mean, I have plenty in my church. I could bring them up here and stick them with pins. They're real. They're out there. Now, for theistic evolutionists, for people who would embrace the idea of evolution and still be very devout Christians, for them the concern is not evolution, but the naturalistic, purposeless, random articulation of evolution. One of the fundamental things, the fundamental non-negotiables for a conservative Jew or Christian, whether they accept evolution or not, is that God created all things. And if he created the process of evolution, and that's how things get explained, fine. Then I just look at it and say, oh, that's how God did it. That's interesting. Okay? That's all that needs to be said. And there are verses that could be taken this way. For instance, in Genesis 1:20, this is kind of interesting. I'm not staking a position on it. It doesn't really matter to me. It says that the earth brought forth a whole list of life forms. Okay, Augustine noticed that. Early church fathers noticed. I mean, it's not like they were evolutionists. They didn't know what evolution was. But they noticed that, hey, right here in this verse, it doesn't have God doing it or reproducing after their kind. The earth brings forth these critters. And that isn't really the way it normally happens. Wonder what that means. And so some Christians have noticed that, and it has become a foundational point of articulation for evolutionary theory along with creation, along with a creator. If you also accept evolution as a Christian, if alien life forms, intelligent or not, were discovered, those in this category would assume that God started the evolutionary processes somewhere else. No, the process works on Earth, it works somewhere else, and it produces something that's a little different from us. Ooh, wow, that really scares me. I accept it here, why not accept it there? Now, the real rub, though, comes with people who don't accept evolution. Those who reject it would by default, now catch this, by default, they would be forced to argue that God created alien life forms just like he created life on Earth, essentially out of nothing. There it is. As noted above, there's abundant evidence that this was the position of many Christian theologians prior to Darwinism. Did you catch that? Prior to Darwin, nobody heard of evolution. The idea of a creator God did not have competition. And at the same time that people affirmed a creator God, a very literalistic view, literalistic interpretation of the Old Testament, at the same time, they said, if you don't believe there are other worlds, you're in theological trouble because you're limiting God's omnipotence. They did not have a problem. And what I'm suggesting is if you reject evolution, you don't have a problem today either. If they didn't have a problem then, you don't have one now. The only reason you think you have a problem is because science has planted in your mind this connection that is not necessary. It has put it in your mind that if ET's out there, evolution is the truth. And I don't want to believe in evolution, so I can't believe in ET. Why? I mean, do a little historical research, read some of these older theologians, and you'll find out they had no problem with it. Now, I think we should unpack this a little bit more. A few thoughts. We must realize that the validity of evolution in no way explains the origin of matter present at the beginning of an evolutionary process. How organic matter evolves and how it got there are separate questions. In like manner, an advanced intelligent ET would not answer the question of origins either due to the philosophically untenable notion that a created thing brought the creation into existence, or for other reasons, okay, that we'll get to in a moment. Did you catch that again? Just because there's ET's here, that doesn't explain how ET got here. The fact that he's here and he evolved doesn't explain who started the process. Doesn't explain it at all. We're still left with that conundrum. Another thought, regarding panspermia, the presence of life all over the universe would not prove evolution any more than the presence of life all over the globe. Conservative Jews and Christians could simply posit that God created these other life forms, which is in concert with what they've done for hundreds of years prior to Darwinism. Insisting that the presence of life elsewhere overturns the belief in a creator God is a deliberate choice stemming from your worldview and nothing more. Third, regarding panspermia once again, if God indeed created life all over the universe, it is reasonable to expect a genetic relationship between that life and Earth life on the basis of genetic relationships between life forms here. Why would you expect it to be anything different? This is life as we know it here, especially if evolution is true. There is commonality. Okay, all we're saying is, look, if there's commonality here, why would commonality somewhere else undo the idea of creation? I mean, why does that prove anything? It doesn't. Genetic relationships between life forms do not argue for a cause and effect relationship. Even if intelligent life forms from elsewhere were quite similar to us genetically, or even visually or whatever, it's not sufficient on this point to assume a cause-effect relationship because we are presuming they are technologically superior to us either. We are technologically superior to apes, but we're not their creators. One cannot then retreat and say, well, we're the product of evolution, so that isn't a fair comparison. Well, it is a fair comparison if you believe that ET's here by evolution. I mean, it's just logically inconsistent. What if ET claimed, though, to have made us? The question then becomes how he would prove it. How do we know he's not lying? I mean, one lands on the White House lawn or here on the stage. Hey, I made you. Well, that's nice. Prove it. What's he going to do? Show us a video?
It is I. The journey you undertook to reach me could not have been an easy one.
It was not. The barrier stood between us, but we breached it.
Magnificent. You are the first to find me.
We sought only your infinite wisdom.
And how did you breach the barrier?
With a starship.
This starship. Could it carry my wisdom beyond the barrier?
It could, yes.
Then I shall make use of this starship.
It will be your chariot.
Excuse me.
It will carry my power to every corner of creation.
Excuse me, I'd just like to ask a question. What does God need with a starship?
Bring the ship closer.
I said, what does God need with a starship? Jim, what are you doing? I'm asking you a question.
Who is this creature?
Who am I? Don't you know? Aren't you God?
He has his doubts.
You doubt me?
Seek proof. Jim, you don't ask the Almighty for his ID.
Then here is the proof you see.
Now catch this. Any of the means that we would think would be persuasive to human beings, something visual, a past record or something like that. I hate to be this flippant, but if we could fake it, do you think he's smart enough to? If we have agendas, do you think they might? I mean, if Richard and others want to talk about the image of God, and we'll get there in a moment, the image of God, if it is shared, implies a whole lot of things, okay? You cannot divorce intent, motive, conscience, or seared conscience, intuition, again, any of the thought processes that go on in our minds, good or evil. Why would we assume that it's all of a sudden not in them? Again, it's an assumption that is unwarranted and frankly unprovable. And I'd love to I guess I will. If E.T. were to pop here on the stage and say, hey, Mike, we put you here, I would say, well, a great philosopher and scientist once said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I would just love to throw Sagan's quote right back at an E.T. I mean, that would just make my day. So I do know what I would say if I ran into one, and if he claimed that. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, okay, if God created other life forms in the universe, would he love them? This really gets a little more serious. This is where the early church, struggled a bit. Would they be fallen? Could they do evil? If so, would God redeem them? Would he take them to heaven? Would he offer them a way of salvation? In Christian language, would Christ's death also be for their sin, or would he have to be incarnated and die an ad infinitum number of times, like Thomas Paine was ridiculing? And that brings up the third issue of concern. A lot of people are worried that the notion of intelligent alien life undoes the doctrines of the incarnation of Christ and redemption. This is the way C.S. Lewis, a famous Christian author, put this. He said, if the universe is teeming with life, again, he's just stating the position, this, we are told, reduces to absurdity the Christian claim that to this one planet God came down and was incarnate for us and our salvation. Paul Davies puts it this way, of all the world's major religions, Christianity is the most species-specific. Jesus Christ was humanity's Savior and Redeemer. He did not die for the dolphins or the gorillas, and certainly not for the proverbial little green men. But what of deeply spiritual aliens? Are they not to be saved? Are we to contemplate a universe that contains perhaps 1 trillion worlds of saintly beings in which the only beings eligible for salvation are the really bad ones on earth? I mean, this is how Davies, framed the question. Catholics, again, and others, see where this is going about this multiple incarnation thing, and that's what spooks them. Now, this alleged problem proceeds along a number of assumptions, all of which I believe are flawed. In Christian theology, all humans need to be redeemed, to have their moral guilt before a holy God erased and forgiven. The mechanism for this is the sacrificial death of Christ on behalf of all humanity and his resurrection. Salvation cannot be merited, but is imparted to all those who put their faith in what Jesus did. This is the gospel. As such, Davies' comments in particular show a fundamental misunderstanding of the gospel, for one thing. But be that as it may, the assumption that E.T. needs a savior would have to be based on the prior assumption that E.T. was guilty before God. The guilt would in turn have to be incurred when and if E.T. failed a moral test, like the one put to Adam and Eve in an event called the fall. Now, some thoughts for you. The fact that E.T. is intelligent has nothing to do with his need of salvation. Adam and Eve were intelligent creatures, but did not need salvation until they sinned. E.T. would only need salvation if there was a fall for E.T. The Bible teaches that every human bears guilt before God. Since E.T. is not human, he is exempt without a fall. E.T. would not need a savior, and so that makes the question moot. I would like to say it makes the question silly. But nevertheless, it was a serious question within the church. Why would we assume God would test the ETs he created? He might, but this is not required, and God would not be forced to do this because he did it on earth. And if he did not test ET and ET was unfallen, the whole problem is moot. The fact that ET was a created being in God's grand creative output also does not mean that salvation is necessary. Animals don't need to be saved, yet they are part of the new heaven and the new earth at the time of the end. Angels are also intelligent created beings, and they are not included in the plan of salvation according to the Bible. If there are aliens, they may also have been excluded from the plan of salvation. One would not need to conclude from this that they, like fallen angels, would be eternally punished. They might just die, and that's it. Okay? Now, on the other hand, and this is where I want to go, because I'm amazed, I'm just frankly amazed that everybody I've seen write on this subject acts like Romans chapter 8 doesn't exist. Romans chapter 8 and Colossians chapter 1 answers this question. And it's like, could someone please quote the Bible if we're talking about it? ETs, on the other hand, would be included under the atonement of Christ, but not in a spiritual salvation sense. Here's how they would be included. They would be included with everything else in the created world, the created cosmos. Romans 8. Now listen to this as I read. Paul says, "For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which will be revealed in us. For the earnest action itself also," catch this, "the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of the corruption of the fall into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and travails in pain together until now." Paul says, because of what Christ did, the whole creation, every speck of the cosmos, will be made new. And you are only excluded from that if you retain moral guilt before God. If you essentially thumb your nose at God's plan for you to participate at that time. And if the angels, if ETs, whatever, if they have never become morally guilty before God, they're in. They've got the ticket. And it's by God's design. Just read your Colossians 1. Same idea. Again, I'm amazed that it's like nobody knows these passages are there. Colossians 1, Paul writing again, "For this cause we also, since the day we heard it, do not cease to pray for you, and so desire that you might be filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding, and that in all things he might have the preeminence. For it pleased the Father that in him should all fullness dwell, and having made peace through the blood of his cross by him, to reconcile all things unto himself, by him, whether they be things in earth or things in heaven." But one of the reasons that God came up with the plan of the incarnation and redemption was so that the entire cosmos, which he, through Christ, created, could be saved and redeemed. The only way you are not in that group is if you retain deliberately by your own choice your moral guilt before God. If you've never had moral guilt before God, if you've never fallen, and again, if ET's out there and there's no fall out there on another planet, he's in. This is a totally moot, irrelevant question. And I don't know why it has plagued the church for so long. Lastly, the fourth major, again, fear creator is that, okay, the church has put an awful lot of stock in human beings having a special relationship to God. And that is usually referred to by this phrase we get in Genesis, the image of God. That humankind, male and female, are created in God's image. We get this phrase. Now, the reasoning goes like this. The assumption is that the image of God refers to our intelligence, our ability to commune with God. Perhaps some theologians have said our ability to speak a language, to communicate, because the image of God separates us from animals. There's been a whole array of I can give you a list of things that people have said, well, this is the image, this is what it means. One of them, as Richard implied today, and I can't remember who he quoted, said that the image is a physical likeness. Now, that's the easiest one to rule out. And I wish I knew who Richard will tell me later who the quotation comes from. Because Jesus says very plainly in John chapter 4 that God is a spirit. He does not have a body. Okay, so the image, the likeness of God, does not refer to physical form. I mean, that would take you into all sorts of gender problems too. Okay? God does not have a body. I mean, no theistic system teaches that God has a body. Now, God appears in physical form in the Old Testament and the New. If you're a Christian, you would naturally say that's Christ. There's a lot of that going on in the Old Testament as well. He appears that way, and most of the time it's visual, but sometimes you can actually touch, and it's a physical form. But God does not have a body. He can use one if he likes, and sometimes he does. It's a lot easier than maybe speaking out of a cloud or a fire, even though God does that too. But he does not have a body. He is a spirit. It's very clear. So what is the image? What about the image of God? I would suggest to you, let me do it this way. Here's what you have to have in terms of the image of God. Let me read you the passage that Richard had up. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, over the livestock, so on and so forth." So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. This phrase is actually pretty rare. It's only like 3 or 4 times. There's another one in Genesis 5 where it says, this is the account of Adam's line when God created humankind. He made him in the likeness of God. He created the male and female, so on and so forth. And Adam has a child, and the child is in God's image also. And then there's a reference to a capital punishment institution in Genesis 9. But that's it. So what does the image mean? Well, I would suggest you need certain things. Both men and women have to have it, male and female. The image is that which makes humankind distinct from the rest of Genesis, the rest of all creation. There's something about the image that makes us like God. There's nothing in the text to suggest that you get it in stages. I mean, you either have it or you don't. And this is an important issue for ethics. You know, the whole abortion debate, the beginning of life, end of life, when are you a person? When do you cease to be a person? What about the field of animal cognition? It's a whole field in psychology that animals do have intelligence. And oh, by the way, they do have communication ability. You've assumed that they don't have communication if they can't communicate from them to you. Why not across species? You're telling me that a termite colony, there's no intelligence? I mean, how do you define intelligence? If you have an animal that remembers how to do one thing that it doesn't pop out of its mother's womb knowing how to do, if you have taught it to do something and it remembers that has to be intelligence. And you read in this field, you get all these tests, and frankly, some of them are really funny, where they'll set up intelligence tests. You know, they got the chicken, they've got some bug, they've got a puppy and a kitten, and then a toddler. And like the toddlers always end up failing all the tests, And it's simple repetition and memory. Now, you can either dismiss the toddler as an intelligent life form, or you define intelligence in a way that incorporates these things in the animal world. What about artificial intelligence?
You don't mind talking about it, do you, Dave?
What about extraterrestrial intelligence? What about angelic intelligence? They're not human either. I mean, it just doesn't work. And so what I'd like to suggest is actually a point of Hebrew grammar, and I'm not going to have a linguistic spasm here. But as a point of Hebrew grammar, think of it this way. I'm going to tell you how the verse should be translated, but I'm going to illustrate it in English. Think of the phrase, in the image of God. Now, I don't want to sound like President Clinton, but the word in, the word in does have variation in meaning. He used the word is, and we won't touch that. Okay, in. If I say, put the dishes in the sink, what do I mean? I'm talking about location. In denotes location. If I say, the pot broke in pieces, I'm not talking about location there. I'm talking about the result. Some force acted upon the pot. The result was that it became in pieces. If I say, I worked in banking, sometimes my wife wishes I did. I had to say that. I worked in education. I worked in ministry. I worked in chemistry. What do I mean? It means I worked as a banker, as a teacher, as a chemist. I worked in the capacity of a banker, a chemist, a teacher. Take that back to Genesis. And again, in Hebrew grammar, this is called, here's my linguistic spasm, forgive me. This is called the bet essentia, or the bet of predication. The word in Hebrew is the little letter B, bet in Hebrew. It's attached to the noun tselem, image. And it should be translated, God created humankind as his image. The meaning is this. It has nothing to do with intelligence or this whole list. Every human being is God's representative on earth. You function as though God were here physically. This is what theologically gives your work meaning. You should work as a human being and do the best job you can at whatever you do, because you should do it understanding that God put you there and you're supposed to do your job like he would. And it's wonderful in the sciences because There's a great theological justification for going into science. What is it? Look, you should look at science like God does. You should learn to think about it like God does. Learn what makes it tick and learn it well. Understand the secrets of the physical universe. Wherever you're at, you are God's representative, every human being. And that is an intrinsic quality of humanness. It has nothing to do with theology or religion, what denomination you are. You are human. You are God's imager. You are his representative. Here's the point. E.T., if he exists, is not God's representative on earth. Only humans are. Now, if God wants to make E.T. his representative on some other planet, I'm going to agree with the principle of plenitude and say, well, God, I guess you can do that. We try not to put God and can't into too many sentences. Okay? That's all we're saying. The image of God does make humanity certifiably unique. The animals are not God's representatives. The plants are not. Only human beings are. And the command, if you look in the next two verses, God puts them on earth. Be my imager on earth. He doesn't say, be my imager on Saturn, okay, or on some planet that I'd tell you about, but you really wouldn't get it anyway. Okay, he says on earth. Okay, and that is the point. So it makes humankind certifiably unique among all creation, but it does not preclude in any way E.T. being intelligent. All those, the whole list, intelligence, emotion, ability to commune with God, these are secondary things that help us fulfill our mission, but they do not define what the image is. They're tools to act as imagers. They are not the image itself. The image is a status on this planet. No other planet on this one. So these four things, this ongoing perpetuation of science that somehow says if E.T.'s out there, it is deadly to a theistic worldview. You can just scrap the idea of a creator. If we find E.T., the creation idea, in whatever form it takes, is toast. Okay, that's one obstacle. Two is, again, the accumulation of bogus theological worries within Christian circles. Again, I think that the problems that have been created are artificial. Before I go, I would like to throw this out. One thing that I've also noticed reading through this material is how people who want desperately to believe in extraterrestrials, for them it has become a religious faith and a religious pursuit for many of them. Listen to Dr. Frank Drake, who's famous for the Drake equation. I thought this was really interesting. I mean, his interests clearly began, this is a quote from his autobiography, as a search for a religious substitute. He says, "I've been waiting for this moment nearly all my life. Indeed, if there is anything unusual about my otherwise normal childhood, it is that I started tracing my ties to alien civilizations of intelligent life in the universe at age 8. I did this in spite of my family's fundamentalist religious beliefs and despite their scorn for fantastic ideas." It's pretty blunt. He traded one religion for another. So I started the discussion, asking the question, well, if there's an extraterrestrial reality out there, can the Judeo-Christian world accommodate it? I'd like to end it by asking this question. If evidence of intelligent extraterrestrial life never surfaces, for sure, if the astronomical odds that life is out there are never beaten, if the problem of matter creating itself is never scientifically demonstrated and made philosophically coherent, if the evidence for intelligent design of life on Earth cannot be answered by appeal to ET designers, then will the scientific materialists who look for the blessed hope of ET be able to sustain their belief system? Thanks. The Hebrew alphabet is based upon something called the acrophonic principle. And all, isn't that an impressive word? All that that means is that there are words in the Hebrew language, where the person who Hebrew actually adopted, as Dave told us today, the Phoenician alphabet. And it actually goes further than that. It goes back to Egypt. But the word for house in the language began with the B sound. And so that became the letter B, bet, B-E-T-H in English. So bet is the name of the letter, but it is also the word for house. Yes.
But it's also a verb, is it not? It's causing, containing.
Well, I mean, the examples you give aren't necessarily verbs. Housing would still be a noun. Containing would be a verb. It's also a preposition. I can't think. I mean, this doesn't mean that that's not correct. I can't think of any references where the idea is a verbal, or used as a strict verb. But there might be in some other Semitic language. I can't think of any examples. It's a pretty common word. I guess I'll have to leave it there. I can't think of an example, but maybe there's one out there. Is there a reason why? I mean, were you going somewhere with that, or?
Well, some of the reading I've been doing indicated that there was this verseness in the language, or a process, as opposed to static containment.
Well, to be really honest with you, if you're a good rabbi or a good Kabbalist, you can pretty much make any word say. I can't. When we're trained in linguistics, you adopt the word meanings, very strictly, the way they're used in context in the languages. But rabbis and exegetes, both in Christian and non-Christian, Jewish tradition, felt very free to depart from that. So I have no doubt that you would have read that somewhere. They just felt they didn't feel restricted, that they had to stay with what modern linguistically we would be doing. Anybody else? The question was, is the discussion of extraterrestrial stuff all about cults? Or I would guess you would put the occult in there as well. It really depends what you're talking about. When we started thinking about this conference, we wanted this conference to address not ufology and not abductions and things like that. Those things are naturally related to the question of extraterrestrial life, but the areas are actually different. In other words, if you took ufology as an umbrella discipline, if any of you have read The Facade or seen my website, and I would be in concert with Dr. Ross here, that much of what passes for ufology is very occult-laden. Now, that doesn't mean all of it is, but much of it is. Much of it, I think other parts of it break down into different areas. But all of that is separate from the question of is there extraterrestrial life out there. This is a question that has been discussed in the church for centuries. I mean, and nobody's thinking about linking Aquinas, when Aquinas addresses the question of extraterrestrial life, he's not wondering and speculating if it's related to ghosts or paranormal visions or these new age kind of things that get lumped into the issue. And so what we wanted to do here was we wanted to say, hey, this isn't about ufology. It's about this age-old question that in the SETI program, for instance, has been approached scientifically. So we wanted to approach it academically. That's a long way of saying it really depends on what your friend is thinking you came to listen to. If you wound up going to something about abductions, there's a lot of similarity between abduction claims and satanic ritual abuse. That's just a fact. 1992 MIT conference on alien abductions. There's a very long paper on that, and it's not just one or two correlations, it's 30 or 40. Now, that doesn't mean that that's an explanation for every experience, every event. But these kind of things are very traceable in the literature, both in modern era and the medieval era that are often associated with the occult activity. In my mind, that doesn't have anything to do with the question we're talking about today. So I don't think she has a reason to be concerned. Yes, sir. Next. The idea that ufology is related to the occult is not a Christian dogma. Have you ever heard of Jacques Vallée? He is not a Christian. He's the French ufologist. He doesn't do ufology now. He lives in San Francisco. He has his PhD's in computer science. He runs a company out there. Vallée, if you read his books, and he's been involved in it since the days of Hynek. He is not a hack. He's a good researcher. He's a good scholar, but he believes that 90+% of the UFO field or phenomenon is either a misunderstanding of what people observe, or it is a direct occult thing. He is not a Christian. In fact, he has some real problems with the Catholic Church, and he's very vocal about that. John Keel, the Mothman prophecies. These people have no religious axe to grind, but they notice occult motifs in the literature they read within ufology and in the medieval era, during the occult Renaissance in America, the spiritualist era, all the way back. And what they're doing is they're being honest. They're saying, look, a lot of this stuff, the similarities are just there. And again, I'm not saying that everybody who does UFO research is into the occult. I don't believe that. But on the other hand, I can't deny that there's just a lot of this stuff that is just hitting you in the face that's similar. And so I think Christians tend to see that, plus the media, the TV, how it gets associated with really scary things, and they make that jump. But it isn't the way it used to be. It used to be a legitimate question. I think it still is, but I do think that the field of ufology can be parsed into the people who do science, the people who do serious philosophy and theology, and then there's occultism in whatever form it is. And unfortunately, people who don't read enough about it will draw one conclusion or the other. And you people like you get stuck in the middle. Yes, sir. You're basically asking if the terms for earth or dry ground are specifically generic, or that's an oxymoron. If they're generic enough to refer not just to the planet Earth. I think, to be honest, I don't think you can take that as a reference to other worlds, because you're really dealing with two words. Earth is Eretz in Hebrew. Ground is Adamah, related to Adam. Adam was taken from the dust of the ground. They're just used over and over and over and over again just for the stuff we stand on, both of them. You talk about the lights shining on the earth or on the ground. I think to apply Occam's razor, if I can steal that, light is shining on me now. To have the light shine on ground, I think the most basic reading of that is that the lights are out there in the atmospheric sphere, wherever you want to put that, or however you want to parse that. I'm not a scientist, so I'm probably not saying it correctly, but they shine on the ground. And since Genesis 1 is about the creation of the heavens and the earth, singular, I think that's the best way to read it, that it's talking about this planet here. This is one of these moments where, do I say what I really want to say? The question is, there's this teaching that the Torah was dictated word for word from the mouth of God. And the question related to the issue of the possibility that there are Bible codes in the Torah, and has that changed? This is the essence of your question. Has that changed the way Jews and Christians look at the Torah? Is that what you're basically asking? Okay, what I'd really like to say is this: I've seen it change Jews and Christians. I've seen it make them silly, because this idea, I'll put it this way. Show me a person who believes in a Bible code, and I will show you a person that doesn't understand anything about the transmission of the Old Testament. And what I mean by that, it sounds harsh, but I think it's necessary to say it that way. We have thousands of manuscripts of the Old Testament, either in whole or in part. They do not all agree in every place. Dead Sea Scrolls, showed this abundantly. Yes, there's a high degree of transmission accuracy, high 90 percentile. There's nothing like Old and New Testament for textual transmission on the planet. it exceeds any piece of classical literature exponentially. But what that means is that if you're going to go with this idea that the Torah, you take out all the vowels and have this chain of letters, and then you feed it into the computer and you set parameters in the computer and it spits out blocks of text, and then you find meaningful combinations on that. You're only using one text. You're only using one manuscript, as it were. In the case of the Bible Code, they use the 1966 Koren edition of the Masoretic text. There are literally thousands of other manuscripts of the Torah that do not all agree in every letter with that text. So they arbitrarily picked a text, excluding all the other manuscript data, and if you add one letter or take one letter out, if there's a manuscript difference, it shifts the whole code. Not only that, but the scribes, the Masoretes, which is a scribal term, they actually produced a system of notes, footnotes, as it were. Since they were responsible for copying the Old Testament, every once in a while they would come across, a manuscript difference or something they just thought, boy, I remember seeing a manuscript a few years ago and it didn't have this letter in it. I mean, they were that good. I mean, they had the entire thing memorized, letter for letter. But what they would do is they would make notes when they suspected that there could be a problem in transmission. They wouldn't necessarily change it because it was the text of God, but they would at least tell you that there might be a problem here. We have those notes. It's called the Masorah. And we actually have all that stuff, the textual remarks that they made. Bible Code doesn't incorporate any of that either. I mean, I could just go on and on about what the problem with the Bible Code is that the data set that they use is arbitrary and thus flawed from the beginning. Now, if you could somehow determine every letter from all the manuscripts, which ones are correct, which ones are not, and then feed that into a computer and you come out with meaningful combinations, that would be something to look at. But the problem is with the data set. And to be really honest with you, I think a lot of people, for whatever reason, and I think it's just our scientific culture, they seem to think that proves the inspiration of the Bible. And generations have come and gone, and people didn't need that. I don't think we need it now. To reduce the Bible to empirical number crunching and using a flawed data set at that, I think people just want to be able to somehow, quote, scientifically prove something that is providential. It's like proving there's a God. You can't do it one way, you can't disprove it the other way, and I think that's where it needs to be left. I just think it's a misguided pursuit. It's not that people are unspiritual or not intelligent. I just think it's misguided, and it's just affected people adversely in the way they look at Scripture.